At 1:04 in the morning, on October 14th, 1939, HMS Royal Oak shuddered. The battleship was supposed to be riding at anchor, but the chain was now severed, and a small hole had been punched through the starboard bow. Secured inside Scapa Flow, Britain's most impenetrable naval base, the crew could only assume there had been an accident on board. No one thought to search the water. Underneath the waves, what had actually hit the Royal Oak couldn't believe it now had a chance to reload. It was cramped inside the German submarine. Nearly 50 men inside a metal box, where changing clothes was a luxury and access to fresh water was limited. However, Captain Lieutenant Gunther Prien was not bothered. Nothing could spoil his first patrol, commanding one of Germany's newest naval predators. He'd waited years for this moment, studying the art of navigation day and night, serving alongside some of the Kriegsmarine's most skilled sailors, and even overseeing the construction of the very boat he now commanded. That vessel was officially known as U-47, a member of the new Type 7B family. Compact, fast, and brutally efficient, it was an underwater attacker designed for sudden dives and rapid attacks. 5 torpedo tubes gave it the ability to keep on firing at our enemies with virtually no rest, while an 88mm deck gun crowned the hull, ready to finish off wounded prey once the boat broke the surface. It was August 19th, 1939, and while war had not yet begun, Hitler and his Kriegsmarine were already placing as many U-boats as possible across the front lines, so that as soon as the Fuhrer gave the order, they could all strike at once. For weeks, Prien prowled the Atlantic with his eyes fixed on the radio, waiting for the message that announced the start of the hunt. Luckily for him, he wouldn't have to wait too long. On September 3rd, the voice of Kriegsmarine Command crackled through U-47's radio system. Just 2 days earlier, German troops had crossed into Poland. Now, France and Britain were openly declaring war. The sun was just creeping over the horizon on September 5th when the crew aboard U-47 rushed to Prien with a promising report. Lookouts had just spotted the silhouette of a British cargo ship passing through the darkness. Its captain was steering in a zigzag pattern, most probably as a desperate attempt to dodge any enemy fire that might rise from below to meet his crew. Sadly for the British, this wouldn't be enough to save them. As the German Predator closed in on its prey, the captain lieutenant ordered the boat to surface. More than a few crew members looked at each other with the corner of their eyes. The war had just started, yet even then, sailors knew how risky it was for a submarine to go up against an enemy vessel out in the open. Still, no one dared to contradict Prien's orders. U-47 broke through the surface, close enough for the Germans to identify the ship as the British merchant Bosnia. Prien opted to show mercy. One warning shot, one chance for the vessel to stop and evacuate her crew, in accordance with the prize regulations still in force. The tracer round streaked across the water, passing close enough to send the British crew scrambling into emergency mode. Instead of stopping, the merchant surged ahead at full steam. Radio operators sent out a distress call, broadcasting their position to anyone listening. But there was no one close enough who could arrive in time to stop the inevitable. Prien sighed. He'd given them the easy way out. Now his crew would have to teach the Allies a lesson the hard way. U-47's deck gun fired 4 more rounds. 3 slammed into Bosnia's hull. Prien smiled to himself. Not bad for a first go. Aboard the British ship, panic took hold. The deck shuddered beneath their feet. Systems began to fail as black smoke poured from the impact points. There was no escape, no place to hide besides the cold Atlantic water below. And that was where everyone went. Once the ship was evacuated, Prien gave the final order. A single torpedo, fired with enough precision to send the 2,407-ton merchant to the bottom. The explosion was brutal, sending Bosnia beneath the waves before the very eyes of Prien and his crew. It was U-47's first victory, but by no means her last. As the German submarine turned away, leaving the survivors of the wreckage to the mercy of a neutral Norwegian ship closing in to rescue them, it took only a few hours for Prien and his crew to encounter another victim. This time the British cargo ship Rio Claro, nearly twice the size of the vessel they had just destroyed. The captain lieutenant didn't even allow U-47's guns to cool before ordering them to go off once more. By the time Prien returned to Germany, he and his boat were already legends within the ranks of the Kriegsmarine. In just under a month, the captain lieutenant had sunk 3 British merchant vessels. His latest victim, the smaller Gardavan, had been found and destroyed just 1 day after the attacks on Bosnia and Rio Claro. At the Admiralty, however, Karl Dönitz, newly appointed Konteradmiral, or Rear Admiral of the Kriegsmarine, believed Prien could go even further. Hunting merchant ships was crucial for the war effort, but the Rear Admiral craved for a symbolic victory that showed Hitler U-boats were the future of the naval war effort. Dönitz set his sights on the Royal Navy anchorage at Scapa Flow, a narrow body of water enclosed by the Orkney Islands in northern Britain. It was considered a virtually impregnable fortress, one of the most critical bases from which the Royal Navy could monitor and intercept German vessels attempting to break out into the Atlantic through the North Sea. By early October, Dönitz sent aircraft to spy over Scapa Flow, and the reports were promising. Near Kirk Sound, block ships were found to be poorly positioned, leaving gaps wide enough for a German submarine to slip undetected. Still, this would be far from a risk-free mission. Decades earlier, during World War I, German submarines had already attempted to penetrate Scapa Flow, only to be destroyed before they could inflict any considerable damage on the Royal Navy. This time, however, Dönitz believed he had just the right man and the right submarine to give this daring plan a second chance. Prien left port on October 8th, steering through the water passage between Denmark and Sweden as he set his course for northern Britain. The mission was so secret that no one aboard knew U-47's true destination except the captain lieutenant himself. But while the sailors did not know what they had signed up for, as Prien repeatedly ordered torpedoes kept armed, deck guns ready, and scuttling charges prepared, they understood something colossal awaited them. It was not until 5 days into the mission that the crew finally caught sight of their target, as U-47 began a slow surfacing off the coast of the Orkney Islands. More than one heart must have sunk. This was the cursed anchorage no German sailor had ever managed to breach. Yet now, here they were, alone, and preparing to attempt the impossible. Prien stood on the bridge, surveying the terrain and analyzing the best path forward. The night was calm, but much to the crew's frustration, the northern lights had just ignited the sky above, casting an eerie glow over their boat that threatened to expose her position to any British patrols nearby. For a brief moment, the thought of turning back crossed the captain lieutenant's mind. But Prien had not come this far just to retreat at the last minute. He turned to his crew, nodded once, and gave the order. It was time to enter Scapa Flow. With their breath held, the crew of U-47 crept toward Rose Ness, the eastern entrance to the anchorage. They were so close to land that the dark shapes of the shoreline ahead were already beginning to take form. However, before they could move any closer, a lookout shouted a warning. A ship was inbound, heading straight toward them. There was no time to determine whether this was a warship or whether her crew had already spotted the Germans. Prien gave the order, and U-47 plunged beneath the surface, continuing her hasty advance toward Scapa Flow as she disappeared into the depths. The descent was so rushed that sailors had to grab onto anything within reach to keep from being thrown off their feet, fighting to keep up and ready in the event that a battle erupted. For 30 minutes, no one dared move. Prien and his men waited in silence, expecting the sudden thunder of depth charges detonating next to them to announce they'd been detected. But as U-47 pressed on, no explosions came. Perhaps the submarine had gotten lucky. Slowly, the boat rose once more, her hull softly breaking the surface as the crew inspected the terrain for any sign of danger. The Germans had just entered Holm Sound, the doorway to the anchorage, and there were still no enemy ships in pursuit. The infiltration phase had succeeded. Now it was time to carry out the job they'd been sent here to do. With torpedoes primed, U-47 sliced through the water with her hull exposed. Prien knew the risk he was taking, but remaining on the surface was the fastest way to locate his targets and strike while the element of surprise was still on his side. Most of the capital ships Dönitz had identified in the reconnaissance photographs days earlier were already gone, leaving behind mostly destroyers, which Prien kept a careful eye on. They were not the kind of trophies a captain lieutenant dreamed of after such a dangerous mission, but they would have to do. But before Prien gave the order to fire, he noticed a new shape forming in the darkness, not too far from U-47's position. It was massive, more than 600 feet long, crowned by a prominent superstructure rising from the center of the deck. By the layout of her guns and armor, the Germans could tell this was a veteran of the First World War, the Revenge-class Titan HMS Royal Oak. She lay at anchor beside the seaplane carrier HMS Pegasus, completely unaware of the danger slipping silently toward her. Prien smiled. He'd found his victim. On the decks of HMS Royal Oak and HMS Pegasus, most sailors were still asleep. There was no reason to scan the darkness for danger. At Scapa Flow, the British felt beyond reach. Then, without the ship's engines roaring to life or the helm turning, the entire battleship suddenly trembled. Some sailors were jolted awake, glancing at one another in confusion. Still, no alarms sounded. The vessel was decades old, and it was not unusual for an internal malfunction to make her hull quake. Many dismissed it as a system failure and drifted back to sleep, ignoring the only warning they would receive before doom descended. Roughly 4,000 yards away, Captain Lieutenant Gunter Preen had just fired the first salvo of torpedoes toward Royal Oak and Pegasus. The initial shudder on the battleship had been caused by one of the torpedoes striking near Royal Oak's bow, severing an anchor chain, yet failing to inflict enough damage to take out the ship. As Preen observed the quiet deck ahead, however, he realized he'd been granted a rare opportunity, a second attack run, without the threat of immediate counterfire. U-47 swung sharply back into position as her crew reloaded the torpedo tubes. 3 torpedoes surged through the dark water. On deck, sailors were hurled from their bunks once again as a far more violent shock tore through the ship with enough force to make it feel as if the entire hull had suddenly been lifted out of the sea. This time, there was no question about it. The ship was under attack. Men scrambled topside, scanning the darkness for their attacker, but the compact submarine delivering the blows remained invisible. Below deck, systems failed almost instantly. Power was lost. Communications were severed. Watertight doors slammed shut, trapping hundreds of young sailors deep inside the ship. There was no time to repair the damage or reach those left behind. Royal Oak was already listing heavily, as thousands of tons of seawater poured through the ruptured hull. For many, there wasn't even time to reach the lifeboats. Their only option was to leap into the freezing water as the battleship continued to sink. Of the 1,234 men aboard Royal Oak that night, only 401 managed to evacuate. This time, the Germans would not sit around and wait to ensure survivors were rescued, and as the last section of Royal Oak vanished, Preen ordered U-47 to turn away and flee before the British destroyers racing toward the crime scene spotted the submarine. Despite her ability to infiltrate enemy waters and her proven firepower, U-47 was not built for speed. As Preen pushed his crew to run the engines at maximum output and race for the exit of Scapa Flow, the submarine could barely crawl forward, fighting a violent tide that threatened to drag her back into the anchorage. In the distance, the captain lieutenant spotted one of the patrolling destroyers closing in, its searchlight sweeping the water in search of the assassin that had just claimed HMS Royal Oak. Worse still, high above, the northern lights continued to glow, casting a telltale shine that outlined the submarine's silhouette in the distance as she struggled to escape. But before the destroyers could pinpoint her position, U-47 forced her way ahead, battling the current and reaching the narrow exit of the anchorage just in time, slipping clear without a single enemy charge ever being dropped her way. As the British islands faded behind them, cheers erupted inside the submarine. The men on board had just made history. Britain's most secure harbor had been breached, and now the Royal Navy would know that nowhere was truly safe from the Kriegsmarine. Preen, however, was not quite as ecstatic as the rest of his men. As U-47 slipped back into the Atlantic and turned for home, he went back to his chambers, recording a single line in his war diary, quote, "A pity that only one of the ships was destroyed." But back in Germany, no one would have dared to ask any more from the captain lieutenant or his boat. The moment Preen and his crew set foot on land, they were rushed aboard an aircraft and flown straight to Berlin, where Adolf Hitler himself awaited them, Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross in hand. The raid had just proven that German U-boats were about to become some of the Third Reich's most notable sea champions, capable of striking where surface fleets could never reach. Certainly, tougher battles still lay ahead, but there was no doubt in the mind of the Führer that, led by Preen, who from now on would be known as Der Stier von Scapa Flow, or the Bull of Scapa Flow, German naval supremacy was within reach. But despite his triumph, the Bull of Scapa Flow carried a secret, one that if the Royal Navy were to uncover, might have revealed that his submarine was nowhere near the unstoppable menace Nazi propaganda claimed it to be after the raid. To bring down Royal Oak, Preen had been forced to launch 7 G-7E torpedoes. Despite the size of the salvo, it was believed that only 2 had actually struck the ship and detonated. Still, Karl Dönitz was unwilling to admit that his prized U-boat fleet was sailing to battle with a flawed weapon. U-47 had achieved the impossible with her G-7E torpedoes once, and in his mind, she could easily do it again. To prove it, less than a month after Preen returned to Germany, he was sent back to sea. After nearly 2 weeks of patrolling, the captain lieutenant spotted a new target. It was the British cruiser HMS Norfolk, a massive 10,000-ton warship, which, almost since the start of the war, had been tasked with hunting German raiders across the Atlantic. If she fell, Britain would lose one of its most valuable defenders against the German naval threat. Preen ordered U-47 into attack position, guns trained on the cruiser, and 3 torpedoes readied. Before the ship ahead could detect the presence of the submarine, the captain lieutenant gave the order to fire. This time, however, the submarine refused to cooperate. Of the 3 torpedoes commanded, only one left its tube. It streaked toward Norfolk, but detonated prematurely in the ship's wake. On board the cruiser, sailors watched a towering column of water rise behind them, dramatic yet harmless, leaving not so much as a scratch on the hull. Below the surface, however, Preen was convinced the hit had crippled the ship's stern. Believing his prey mortally wounded, he prepared to finish the job. U-47 burst through the surface, only to be met by an unscathed cruiser and her furious escorts, now fully alert and ready to send the submarine to the bottom. Before Preen could call for another attack, depth charges were already exploding around U-47, tossing her violently from side to side as the crew fought to dive and escape before it was too late. The Kriegsmarine had failed to deliver a new trophy to Germany, but the Reich would not allow the legend of U-47 to fade, and as Norfolk returned safely to port, the Nazis were telling a different story. The Battle of Scapa Flow had just sunk a British cruiser. Preen despised being the public face of Kriegsmarine propaganda, especially when he knew all too well that his beloved U-47 was not fighting as well as she should. But he had no say in the matter. He was the bull of Scapa Flow, and whether he liked it or not, he was expected to live up to his title. For months, the captain lieutenant kept taking his submarine back out to sea. She could still bring down foreign vessels, but on more than one occasion, her torpedoes sabotaged the hunt, either missing their targets or refusing to detonate even after striking an enemy hull. Preen knew the submarine's weaponry required a major overhaul, yet there was no time for improvements. Germany was preparing to crush Denmark and Norway, and U-47 was expected to help pave the way. And so, despite the U-boat's questionable attack capabilities, the submarine put to sea once more. Preen's task once again relied on infiltration, this time targeting an Allied-held anchorage in Vegsfjord, along the southern Norwegian coast. As he had in Scapa Flow, the captain lieutenant maintained a low profile, keeping the submarine deep and steady until she slipped into the heart of the anchorage. Carefully, U-47 rose just enough for her periscope to break the surface. Through the lens, Preen spotted 6 transport ships and 2 cruisers packed tightly together. Preen got U-47 into position, closing to within roughly 750 to 1,600 yards. 8 torpedoes streaked toward their targets. Yet none of them hit. Unwilling to concede defeat, U-47 repositioned and launched 4 more torpedoes. Once again, not a single one succeeded. Some detonated against rocks, others veered off course without explanation. Growing desperate, Preen pressed closer, determined to land at least one clean hit before withdrawing. But as he pushed deeper into the anchorage, the tide fell. The submarine ran aground, slamming into the shallows and damaging one of her engines. It was suddenly clear that despite having found the perfect hunting ground, U-47 would leave without a single victim. With no other choice, the crew rocked the submarine back and forth until she finally broke free, slipping away just in time before Allied forces could find her. U-47 returned home empty-handed, and Preen did not hesitate to make his anger known. In a report to Dönitz, he wrote, quote, "We found ourselves equipped with a torpedo which refused to function in northern waters, either with contact or magnetic pistols. To all intents and purposes, the U-boats were without a weapon." If U-47 was ever going to live up to her full potential, Preen knew she would need a better strategy. The war in the Atlantic was now in full swing, and there was no time to conduct a major overhaul of U-47's weaponry. However, if Preen could find a way around his torpedo's depth-keeping errors, launching raids alongside other submarines, so that if U-47's strike failed, another boat would already be waiting to follow up, then perhaps the bull of Scapa Flow could still live up to his name. The plan was set in motion by mid-1940. According to historians, the captain lieutenant left port to rendezvous with 6 other U-boats out at sea. Preen would act as the leader of the group, which would later be known by some as Wolfpack Preen. Sailing together, the formation set its sights on Allied convoys identified by German naval intelligence, aiming to cut them down before they could reach port. On June 14th, while sailing a few hundred miles off the coast of the French city of Lorient, Prien made contact with convoy HX-47. After months of embarrassing defeats, he knew he had to be careful. They might only have one chance to strike, and a single poorly aimed torpedo could mean their ruin. Trailing just close enough to keep the Allied vessels in sight without revealing their own position, Prien guided U-47 forward, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Suddenly, the opportunity arrived. The British cargo ship Balmoral was struggling to keep pace with the convoy, falling farther behind until it was exposed. It was time for action. U-47 opened fire, launching enough torpedoes so that for every one that failed, 2 more were already racing in to secure a hit. The British merchant ship never even had time to call for help. And by the time Wolfpack Prien withdrew, Balmoral was already slipping beneath the waves. It seemed Prien's new approach had worked. Still, one victory would not be enough to prove that U-47 was truly back in the game. The British were still mourning the loss of Balmoral when the captain lieutenant was already ordering the submarine to strike again, this time against the tanker San Fernando in the Celtic Sea, stripping thousands of tons of crude oil from Allied hands in the blink of an eye. But even then, Prien was not satisfied. Having found her footing once more, U-47 went after any vessel unfortunate enough to cross her path. Whether part of an Allied convoy or a passenger liner filled with civilians, no one was safe from her wrath. On October 19th, the German submarine and the rest of her formation spotted convoy HX-79 and went after it. Gone were the days where faulty torpedoes sabotaged their missions, and as soon as U-47 opened fire, the wake was choked with oil and smoke, bleeding from the shattered Allied formations. Sailors attempted to maneuver clear as soon as they saw the first torpedoes cutting through their ranks, but it was no use. The submarines were too fast, their attacks near impossible to counter. All they could do was flee, leaving their companion vessels burning behind. According to some accounts, Prien's coordinated raids helped the Germans sink as many as a dozen ships in a single patrol. The feat was so extraordinary that while still at sea, U-47's radio crackled to life with a message from Germany. The Reich was awarding the captain lieutenant the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves, making him the first sailor of the Kriegsmarine to receive such an honor. The Bull of Scapa Flow was no longer a propaganda myth. He was a living Nazi weapon, loose in the Atlantic, ready to wipe every last Allied ship from the sea. It was early 1941. U-47 had been at sea for weeks during her 10th patrol. Her ferocity had not waned, harassing convoys and even managing to sink a couple of vessels. But everything changed when she encountered convoy OB-293. The raid began like so many others before it. U-47, flanked by fellow submarines slipping through the cracks of the Allied formation, tore into the convoy, hammering hulls with torpedoes until steel split and ships broke apart. This time, however, the Allied escorts were not about to let U-47 and the rest of the German predators get away with murder so easily. Before U-47 could deliver a decisive blow, the escorts unleashed a barrage of depth charges. U-99 was forced to dive as deep as possible to evade destruction. U-70 was damaged so severely that she was driven to the surface, only to be finished off by gunfire from nearby corvettes. U-47, however, seemed to be holding her own. She weaved through the explosions, continuing to send reports and urgent requests for support back to base. As night fell, Prien felt confident enough to bring the submarine to the surface, giving his crew a clearer view of the surrounding waters and the convoy ahead. It was the last mistake they would ever make. Spotted by the Allied destroyer HMS Wolverine, Prien tried to fight his way free, dodging gunfire for hours as he forced the submarine back beneath the waves. It was not enough, and sometime around 5 a.m, all communication with U-47 was lost. The crew aboard Wolverine could not definitively confirm a victory. All they knew was that after releasing their final pattern of depth charges, just moments after U-47 dived for the last time, the submarine was never seen again. Desperate to preserve the legend of the Bull of Scapa Flow, Germany attempted to conceal the loss. It was useless, and not long after the disappearance of Prien and U-47, the British were already celebrating his fate, broadcasting the same taunt day and night across the airwaves to Germany, quote, "Where is Prien?" The Kriegsmarine could no longer keep this secret. On May 24th, 1941, they issued the message they hoped they never had to, quote, the U-boat under the command of Korvettenkapitan Gunter Prien did not return from its last patrol against the enemy. The loss of the boat must be assumed.